our next speaker is Canon Fairbairn. Her topic today is the nursing Hathor-Cow and the 19th dynasty, use of the cow goddess Nerten motif by 19th dynasty kings. Canon is a postgraduate researcher doing her PhD here in Birmingham, and she is looking at divine nursing scenes of the king. She's also one of the organizers of the From the Breast seminar, as well as these as well. The workshop she did From the Breast explores breastfeeding in pre-modern cultures. She received her master's in art history, Egyptian art and archaeology from the University of Memphis in the USA. Thank you so much, Canon.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Sam. Today, I am presenting one of my case studies from my ongoing research into the role and function of breastfeeding scenes in ancient Egyptian sacred spaces. So today, I'm looking very specifically at a group of scenes, the nursing Hathor-Cow or the nursing cow goddess scenes, with specifically looking at a scene from the tomb of Passer as an example of this, which we've already heard from today. So that'll be great. My research uses case studies to more closely examine how nursing was adapted to different sacred spaces and how it functioned within these spaces to serve different purposes. So I'll begin today with just a very brief overview of divine nursing in ancient Egyptian art. Then I'll look at the nursing cow goddess motif type, looking at its characteristics, its relationship to other motifs. And then we will examine the tomb of Passer again, looking at the role that it has there. And then I will make some preliminary conclusions, as I'm hoping to bring all of my case studies together in the end to really examine the role of breastfeeding. Or maybe I should say nursing, since we're talking about cows. So divine nursing scenes survive from the Old Kingdom through the Greco-Roman period. While they primarily appear in temples, we do have them from jewelry, stelae, votive offerings, and tombs. But the majority do come from temples. And most often, the king is shown nursing from an anthropomorphic goddess, like the examples we have here. However, we do have examples of being nursed by a cow, a snake, or a tree goddess. Current research largely understands these scenes to represent the rebirth or the birth that takes place upon what's been termed the three births of the king: his mortal birth, his coronation, and his death, and that they were used to ensure victory and life to the king. Jean Leconte even suggests that they were a version of a crowning ceremony. However, research hasn't really examined the appearance of these scenes outside of temple contexts, their appearance in jewelry and in tombs, and hasn't really taken into consideration the geographical and historical context. And that's where I'm hoping to fill with my research. So to our nursing cow goddess scene types. In my examination, I have identified 26 surviving appearances of this motif. They survive in wall reliefs, steles, pectoral, and a votive cloth. And the nursing cow goddess motif to this point has largely been seen as just a variation of the anthropomorphic scene. However, as I examine this group of scenes, I realize that this ignores many patterns that we see within this motif. For example, nearly every scene has been identified by context or name as the nurse being Hathor, so the cow is Hathor. Also, the majority of these scenes, the vast majority of these scenes, are associated with Del Bahri and the region of Thebes, which I will talk about in a moment. We also notice that a large number survived from the 18th dynasty and were then used into the 19th dynasty, but they don't seem to have survived much after that until we do have one Roman example. So to define what the motif is, I've looked at all 26 of these, and I've identified 4 different characteristics that can help us understand this motif. So the most important, obviously, is the king kneeling underneath the cow goddess, nursing from her udders. This appears in all 26 and is the most distinguishing feature of this motif. Other features that appear in the majority of these scenes include a second appearance of the king standing underneath the chin of Hathor, the cow goddess wearing a menet or sistrum around her neck, and the presence of the solar disk between her horns with or without the double feathers. This example doesn't have the double feathers, but we'll see it coming up. So this is how I'm defining the motif. The king kneeling beneath the goddess is the key feature, though, which will become important. And as I was examining these 26 scenes, I realized that they share a lot of similarities with depictions of Hathor in the Dale Bahri region and the Theban region in general. And this is significant as the majority of these scenes originate from this area. And I identified specifically 2 other motifs to examine in a bit more depth as to their similarities in purpose and context and appearance. So the first being Hathor emerging from the mountains, where the form of the goddess is incredibly close to our scenes of the nursing cow goddess. We also have this idea of emerging, which I will talk about in a little bit. They also appear in very similar contexts, such as tombs, votive cloths, and steles from these very same areas. We also have the motif of Hathor among the reeds, which not only is the depiction of Hathor very similar, but the use of the boat and papyrus reeds is something that we also see in nursing scenes, and likewise also appear in similar contexts to where we see divine nursing, such as votive offerings, menet counterweights, and other jewelry-like objects. So we have 3 examples of all 3 of these motifs here. All of these come from the Theban region, dated to the 19th dynasty, so the period that we're going to focus on. First, we have here a portion of the Book of the Dead of Ani from the British Museum, and we see Hathor emerging from the mountain through the papyrus reeds, and this will become very similar to statuary, which we will see of this scene later on. In the top, we have a relief from the Hindu chapel of Ramses II from Deir al-Medina, which we've already heard about today, where we can see Hathor among the reeds, where she's on a papyrus boat. The king is under her chin, and he even has the menet collar from Hathor wrapping around his head, as we see in many nursing scenes, and the papyrus in the background. And we can compare this to the appearance of the divine nursing scene on this votive cloth here, which is now at the Met. And the damage, unfortunately, is right on top of the king, but you can see his legs. So we know he's there nursing. And you can see the similarities between all 3 of these motifs. And thus we can place the nursing cow goddess scene within a larger spectrum of Hathor-Cow scenes from the Theban region that are associated with rebirth and life, not just of the deceased or the individual, but of the royal cult themselves. And in this way, we see the king incorporating himself into this decorative tradition. And one of the most interesting ways, maybe not for everybody, is their use on votive cloths. These votive cloths are specifically from Dale Bahri and specifically associated with the worship of Hathor at Dale Bahri. And we can see across them the adaptation of these different motifs in incredibly similar contexts, and in which Hathor appears very, very similar. And so we can see here a great interaction of all of these motifs together within a very specific object type. Further, in addition to its relationship with other motifs, as I was examining this collection of 26 depictions, I began to note regular features across the examples that seem to suggest that many of these images actually depicted statuary. So we can see here from the one of the hypostyle halls at the temple of Hatshepsut at Dale Bahri. This zoom in here, if you can see it. We have 2 features. We have the pulling on a sledge at the bottom, which we know from other statues and other reliefs was used to move statuary in and out of temples or to where they were eventually going to be located. We can even see it being pulled by workers where they've reconstructed them here. And we have this platform base, which is very consistent across reliefs. It doesn't appear in every single one, but it's very, very consistent. And when we get to the examples of the surviving statues, you'll see a very strong similarity there. Other features include their location within a shrine. We have physical representations of these shrines with statues inside, as well as reliefs of statues being located in these types of shrines. We have the presence of a veil. You can see that on the colored image here, that red background with the white and black beads. And it's been suggested that statues were covered partially or fully with veils to obstruct the view of the statue as it was made public. And I'll talk about that more as well. And in general, they are very similar to known statues. We even have an example of a statue being associated with a relief, which Yes. If we look at, we have 3 surviving examples of statues of this motif. That's all, surprisingly. But this one here of Amenhotep III on the end, the statue appears within the shrine, and you can see it just on the other side of the cow goddess, where what appears to be the statue is then replicated on either side of the walls within a shrine with a veil. The only differences between the 2 images is the presence of the papyrus reeds around the statue's neck, and the fact that in the statue, the king is depicted nude, whereas on the wall, he is wearing a kilt. However, other than that, they are nearly identical. And so here we have this interaction between the relief and the statue, and that's very suggestive when paired with all of these other characteristics across the motif type. Other surviving statues are this one of Horemheb, found in Rome, which is a current question I'm working on, and this one of Ramses II here. So what might then be the function of these statues? So we established that many of these reliefs may represent a particular statue type, largely associated with the region of Thebes and Deir el-Bahri in particular. The statues would have been visible as they are attested on votive cloths and stelae and jewelry from the area. And so to some extent, we know that they are at least being seen. This led me to the first question, is it a processional statue? And it was pointed out to me, these are very heavy. And usually processional statues are small because you have to carry them. They're also a little unwieldy, very top heavy. And then in addition, if we compare the images we have of Hathor, and we compare this processional bark scene from Temple of Seti I at Abydos, we notice that the veil and the shrine completely cover the processional statue. The veil is not transparent, it's not depicted behind it. Whereas with depictions of Hathor, we can still see the statue. So this implies that it's not necessarily what we might think of as a traditional processional statue. So there's a couple options. One is that maybe it was just pulled out to be made available and people could approach. And this works very well with many interpretations of the Amenhotep III statue. Many have noted that as she's pulled out, you can see here the divot in the floor, that as the statue is pulled out of the shrine, which is in the mountain, that it's very reminiscent of the emerging from the mountains motif, where Hathor often is shown with papyrus around her neck. And so we have here a very physical tie between these 2 reliefs to suggest that this may have been how the statue was utilized, that it was pulled out of the mountain to reflect this emerging from the mountain motif in a very 3-dimensional way. So we then have evidence of potentially a statue being interacted with where at least certain private individuals, as on the votive clause, could come and present themselves. Stelae and votive offerings were found at the feet of this statue within its shrine. So this led me to the question, why do we only have 3 then? If we have a lot of depictions of this statue, and Deir el-Bahri was a very productive region during this time, and this has a couple suggestions. The number of depictions of kings, other than those of the 3 that we have existing statues of, may suggest that additional statues existed, or that later kings utilized the statues of their predecessors. The Amenhotep III statue appears in a shrine where the king on the walls is Tutmosis III. So we do have some reuse happening here. However, we also have a number of fragments of cow statues from Deir el-Bahri. And this is where we have the issue that the key distinguishing feature of this motif is the king nursing, and he only appears on one side on the statuary. So if you lose that single piece, we can't identify it as a nursing scene. And so I was just searching and I found 2 examples of statues that are very reminiscent of the size of these scenes we have and are dated to the 18th and the 19th dynasty. Then they come from good provenance from Deir el-Bahri. Specifically, both have been associated, they were found near the temple of Mentuhotep II, but due to the dates have been attributed to the chapel associated with the temple of Hatshepsut of the 18th dynasty. And so it is very possible that we do have more examples of this statue, but the distinguishing feature has been lost. Okay. So the evidence of the statuary features in the appearance of the nursing cow goddess motif and its similarity and shared features with other popular cow goddess motifs of the area place this particular type of nursing scene within the wider Hathoric tradition of Del Bahri. This is a tradition which would have included festivals like the beautiful Feast of the Valley and the festivals of drunkenness, the offering of hundreds of votives by people of every social class, the Hathor shrines at the temples of Mentuhotep II and Hatshepsut and other shrines. So within a very rich, decorative, and ritual culture. This has led me to reconsider how I approach these nursing scenes. Rather than approaching them as simply a variation of the anthropomorphic scene that appears in temples or in many temples, this appears perhaps to instead be the incorporation of nursing into a long-standing decorative tradition. So instead of seeing it as a nursing scene, it's the application of nursing. So what might be then, what might be the purpose then of these scenes? Well, it allows the king, the current king, to incorporate himself into the traditions of prior, quote unquote, legitimate dynasties, as was mentioned earlier, that we know that the 19th dynasty kings were using these connections with prior pre-Amarna dynasties to try to legitimize their rule. His incorporation into such a visible statue also allowed the king to participate in the ritual environment of the area and perhaps benefit from it. But this still begs the question, why nursing? Why choose to incorporate the king into a nursing scene when he already appears under her chin? And this is a question I'm still pursuing, and I hope to be able to have further evidence. But currently, I am pursuing the idea that perhaps this is creating a bond, a kinship bond, not just between the king and Hathor as his wet nurse and mother, but the king and prior kings and later kings. Because as they share Hathor as their mother and wet nurse, they could become siblings of a sort. So this is something I'm currently looking for further evidence on and examining Egyptian ideas of siblingship through milk to see if this is maybe why they chose nursing over any other type of interaction with the goddess. So let's look at the tomb of Passer, which has wonderfully been introduced to us fantastically. I will just point out, it is very close to Del Bahri. That is the thing I will add as I get started here. As was mentioned, he served as a vizier under Seti I and Ramses II of the 19th dynasty, where we know the scene is being used. The scene itself, as you can see here, comes from the very similar area to where we were looking at scenes earlier, and depicts Seti I being nursed by Hathor. The scene is no longer in situ. It has been removed from the tomb, but I suggest that this scene here from the Walters Art Museum is the scene itself as suggested by Gertrude Maron. And this is something that I get into in more detail in my thesis. But this is the only appearance of divine nursing from a cow goddess in a tomb. And so I examined this to see if the way it's being used in the tomb was reflected in the way it was being used in temples, to see if that could show us a general way that these scenes were being used and interpreted and understood. So, as was mentioned, in this area of the tomb, Passer has multiple depictions of his role as vizier. And one of the titles I was interested in was his role as vizier of the south, which would have included this region. And we know that he was very prolific and busy in this region, as was noted at Deir el-Medina and other areas where he leaves his name on a lot of things in this region. So by looking at it within the context of Deir el-Bahri and Thebes, we can see that by utilizing this divine nursing scene, like kings, Passer can integrate himself into the Theban region, an important area which he administered as vizier. This would emphasize his power in this area, as well as the power he would have had over festivals and events of the area and the worship at temples. It may have also been used to appeal to visitors as they visited his tomb, as we know that during certain festivals, like the beautiful Feast of the Valley, in which Hathor played a key role, visitors would move among the tombs. It also may have been used to ensure Passer's continued participation in such rituals. So I want to just look at one example of another scene from the tomb and how it may be able to help us better understand this scene. So if we look here at the Henu bark, this is this represents a ritual which is the festival of Sokar, which originally took place in Memphis, but which during the reigns of Seti I and Ramses II was established at their mortuary temples in Thebes, very close to the tomb of Passer and El-Bahri. By the 19th dynasty, Sokar was a god associated with transfiguration and purification of the king after death. And Graindorn Chimerel has suggested that the Sokar festival in Thebes served as a ritual by which power was passed from the deceased king to the living king, facilitated by Hathor. Thus, Hathor serves a similar purpose here, as she does in, say, the beautiful Feast of the Valley, where she played a crucial role in the renewal of the god Amun and the royal cult. Thus, both scenes serve to emphasize the legitimacy of the 19th dynasty and thus Passer by serving them. They both emphasize renewal, as nursing is often interpreted to be this idea of rejuvenation through the milk of the goddess. And both showcase rituals which Passer may have been involved in his time, or at least aware of and have been interacted with. Here, Passer then demonstrates his legitimacy as he crafts his self-presentation. So, a few preliminary conclusions, as this is very much a work in progress. First, the nursing cow goddess motif represents a unique subset of divine nursing scenes with its own traditions and meanings. The king could use this image to promote his legitimacy and connection with prior kings, as well as a region closely tied with the renewal of the king and royal cult. Further, it is suggestive that the themes observed in my examination of the motif used in royal spheres is very reminiscent to its use by an elite private individual like Passer. And finally, this has changed how I view divine nursing scenes, and hopefully how going forward research will view them. That not all scenes are simply variations of each other. That instead, we see here the incorporation of nursing into an existing decorative landscape in order to suggest a relationship between the king, prior kings, and the tradition of that region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Canon. That was absolutely fantastic. Any questions in the room for Canon? Oh no, we're not letting Lente ask a question. It's going to be about Passer, perchance.
No.
Oh.
I'm actually not going to ask you about Passer. I totally agree with you of everything you said, of course. But when you talk about statues, I think that it's very good theory that this was a statue, even though it's depicted as something else. But what I'm thinking is that we don't really have any depictions of or the other divine statues of any divinity from ancient Egypt, and some speculate that it is because they were made of precious materials. So do you think maybe that's the same case when we have the Hathor-Cow statue?
Thank you. That's a great question. And that's something that I've been looking into, because when I first realized that these potentially were statues of the goddess, but they were kept in shrines, my mind went to these very precious statues that have been lost due to the fact they were made of precious materials. And at least for the Amenhotep III statue, we know evidence has suggested that at least the horns would have been gilded, but that has been removed. But the others are just stone statues. And so the research has even noted that this seems to be a bit of an interesting difference, that even though this was kept in that shrine, it doesn't seem to be at least completely made of these precious materials. But we do have evidence on one of them that they were at least gilt, but they are still painted. So that's why I've been pursuing kind of this idea of maybe it serving a different purpose than what we traditionally, or which is a different purpose to the idea of cult statues as being within the temple or in processions, because this seems to fulfill maybe some sort of different role, being the fact that it's not made of these precious materials as much, and that it's much more visible. So it's still a question that I'm looking into. So if you have any ideas, let me know. But it does seem to be fulfilling maybe a midway point almost in some of these regards, but currently no reason. And it could be that many of the surviving statues were made of better materials or more valuable materials, and that's why we don't have them as well. It's very possible. Hope that answers it.
Thank you, Canon. Any other questions in the room? Yeah.
So I'm still trying to sort of figure out exactly the question here. So, but it is kind of related to my research a little bit selfishly. So I'm kind of just interested in this. But we know that the king and often other very high ranking members of the royal court often requested milk specifically from a divine goddess in the afterlife because it was well known to be imbued with all sorts of healing and regenerative powers. So I was wondering if you happen to come across any kind of depictions or textual descriptions of Hathor as a kind of nurse in a funerary context, even as kind of a mourner or a midwife like Nephthys was, for example?
No, it's a great question. And this comes up a lot. And I'll actually start by referring you to the research of Silke Kastrup-Pfeiffer. She's actually looking at these scenes, but focusing on milk. So if you are curious, I will cite her here currently doing research on that. I'm trying to think of Hathor in a funerary context. Typically, other than the Passer scene, which is Hathor, the other divine nurses in funerary context seem to be a bit more varied. So we have Nut as a tree goddess appearing in a funerary context. We have Merit Sagar appearing in funerary context, and they don't seem to be as specific to a specific goddess, at least when they appear in tombs or funerary offerings. Hathor seems to be the most popular. She is by far the most popular during the New Kingdom, but most of those scenes are from temple contexts. I will also note, though, on the topic of milk, that in examining the texts of these scenes, there is not a set text for these scenes, but typically it'll start with the words of whatever the goddess is, I am your mother. And then many of them include the phrase, by means of my milk, I give you. And then they select from, domination, victory, life, stability, whatever it might be. But there is a sense that that milk has a role in the scene. And those are primarily temple contexts. So I would have to look through the funerary contexts in more specifics. Sadly, they're not as well preserved as well, which makes it difficult. And one of the other issues I'm running into is that nursing scenes aren't always labeled as nursing scenes. So they'll be labeled as the king is embraced by the goddess or something. So I'm still searching to see if there's additional evidence in funerary scenes, but the documentation is just can be a bit lacking. But I hope that helps a little bit. But we can talk about it a bit more.
I was going to ask a quick question because I've asked a question in all the other ones and I'm not giving up now. This picture you have up at the moment with the beaded veil, the colors and the kind of texture is very similar to that mountain that Hathor's emerging from. That one. I wonder if the beads are representing it may just be a coincidence, but it's ooh, that's a nice bit of iconography being matched up.
I'll have to look other.
Next time we have coffee, we'll talk about it. It may just be coincidence with the palette they had, but
yeah, I'll look into it.
Fab, thank you. Any other questions in the room before we hand over to Valentina? Come in, Valentina. Do we have any questions in the chat, please?
Yes, we have a few questions, but probably we are running out of time. So I will just ask you one of these and I will forward the others to you because they are very interesting. The first question is, how was a votive cloth used?
That is a great question. I love the votive cloths. So there is a little bit of debate because when these were originally discovered, they were found in rubbish pit. Well, maybe not rubbish pits. They were found in votive pits where they were thrown and they were often very crumpled. So there is a little bit of debate as to how these were actually used because when they were first discovered, they were often cut apart or cut up so that they could be placed in frames for aesthetic purposes and sold. There is evidence that these were actually hung as maybe what we might today think of like bunting. Is the closest thing I could come up with. There occasionally some of them are connected by thin strings, maybe to suggest this idea of bunting. Others have loops, so that to suggest maybe they were pinned to something or hung from something. So current research, no one has really looked at these scenes as a whole yet, but current research thinks that these are probably hung up in some way and would have been visible then to visitors to the tomb, which I think creates a very interesting visual landscape of these ideas of flapping votive offerings, which would have depicted these images of Hathor. But being that they're not really found where they originally would be found, but were found with these other votives, it's very difficult to reconstruct exactly how they would have been used, especially because, as you can see on this one, many have been trimmed. So we lose a lot of the loops or connections that would have been there. I hope that helps.
Of course. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Can you all join me in thanking Canon for her presentation, please?